lovely to look out at to receive a blessing from such blessed people. Thank you, thank you. And thank you, Jan. I'm really touched and not believing a word you said, actually. But it really is. It's just such a delight to be here. I have often said over the many years that I've had the gift of interacting with religious communities, particularly communities of women, that you are teaching us how to live now as we need to move into the future. And it's just, it's beautiful to be with you. It's beautiful to be in Clinton, to see the beauty of this space and the way you care for it and love it. And so thank you, thank you. After so many years of study and promoting nonviolence, it really is a lovely honor to receive an award named for St. Clare. As Jan said, whose way of being offers such interesting inspiration and insights into the nature of nonviolence. I think helping us to see dimensions of nonviolence that we often overlook. Michael Nagler, the founder of the Meta Center for Nonviolence, in his great little book, The Third Harmony, reminds us that when Harriet Tubman woke one morning and said to herself, "I am not a slave," it changed history. Fleeing to freedom in Pennsylvania, she returned to the slave states 13 times to free many other individuals and families through the Underground Railroad. You know that story. By rejecting the identity that her so-called owners tried to impose on her and claiming her own identity as a thinking and feeling human being, she helped break open the steely grip of slavery in the 19th century. Ken Buddigan, a good friend and professor at DePaul University, says that active nonviolence is about creating an opportunity for a new option, a better outcome, often sparking the chance for an unexpected solution, the power of nonviolence. That's surely what Harriet Tubman did. Stories from the legend of St. Clare also tell of Clare's courageous, creative actions that Jan mentioned, and they tell of two particular violent attacks on San Damiano where she lived with her community. In each of those actions, and you know them well, but I find them to be just fascinating examples of nonviolence, she used powerful sacramental action, symbol and ritual, to stop an invading army. It seems almost impossible, but you know the story as well. Once she confronted them with the Eucharist held up in a pyx, and the army turned around and left. And the other time she put ashes on her own head and ashes on the heads of her sisters as a statement of repentance, unexpected, breaking into some new space, but they say it worked. A chance for an unexpected solution. Nonviolence, as you know, has two hands, the way Barbara Deming describes it, one that stops the violence, and the other that is open to the possibility of inbreaking good, even from the perpetrator of the violence. One is destructive, interrupting violence. The other is constructive, building the new way. Clearly, Clare was about not only stopping invaders, but about building a new way in her egalitarian community in which everyone had a voice and everyone was treated with equal dignity. Clare, I think, was courageous, creative, persistent, and nonviolent. So it is really an honor to be associated in any way with St. Clare. Pope Francis talks very often about a Third World War fought piecemeal. We've become familiar with that expression, haven't we? I think, and I suspect you do too, that we are in the middle of it. Even though we are far from Ukraine and Gaza, from Yemen and Sudan. 10 days ago, we were horrified by an attempted assassination of a former president that almost took his life. Our schools are places of worship, our grocery stores, our restaurants have become places where gun violence is all too common. At the same time, our so-called civil discourse is far from civil. It's sometimes hard to tell in our country if anyone has ever heard or cares at all about the common good. A while ago, a friend and her family were picking blueberries somewhere in Illinois. And as they picked, going up and down a road, they could hear people talking who were in the surrounding rows. And she said that every single conversation that they overheard was about violence. We hear those conversations too, don't we? And we have them ourselves, I think, often, about the violence of war, of shootings, of physical assaults, but also the violence of an opioid epidemic, the violence of inadequate health care, the violence of poverty, of racism, of environmental destruction, and on and on and on. I am convinced that nonviolence is the only way that we can bring what Pope Francis calls social peace into the difficult encounters and conversations of daily life, into the public square, where critical decisions are being made every day in what is a hypercharged and divided atmosphere. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis wrote, "Social peace demands hard work, craftsmanship. It would be easier," he said, "to keep freedoms and differences in check with cleverness and a few resources. But such a peace would be superficial and fragile, not the fruit of a culture of encounter that brings enduring stability. Integrating differences is a much more difficult and slow process, yet it is the guarantee of a genuine and lasting peace. What is important is to create processes of encounter, processes that build a people that can accept differences." And I love this sentence. He said, "Let us arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. Let us teach them to fight the good fight of the culture of encounter." I think he pushes into such an interesting space with the way he expressed that. I've occasionally, in talks, I've used language of describing nonviolence as muscular, and people really react to that. They just, "Oh, no, it can't be." I think it has to be. And I think what he's saying here, we have to arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. They have to understand that we can encounter each other and work through conflict and differences without becoming violent. Encounter and dialogue, the tools that Pope Francis called weapons of nonviolence, that can help us move across the ideological divides in our own society to engage in dialogue rooted in truth and respect. Michael Nagler insists that the very process of learning about nonviolence can be uplifting and reorienting, enabling us to transform our anger into nonviolent power. He says, "If we could reach every young person suffering from low self-esteem, low in hope for a meaningful future, not to mention every humiliated youth before he or she falls into the clutches of radicalization, we'd be living in a very different world." I remember listening to, it must have been a podcast from a young man in Minneapolis who had been part of a team that was a credible messenger going into a community where there was a lot of violence. He had been involved in violence locally, and he had taken a course in nonviolent, in de-escalating violence. How do you move into a situation and calm things down? And he said in this podcast something I've never forgotten, which is, if only he had known when he was a younger man, that it was possible to stand up for what you believed or what you wanted without being violent, he would have had a different life. And I have come to believe that the most important work that we can do is sharing that story, is teaching the youngest children how to deal with conflict without violence. We have more access now than ever before in history to the reality of people's lives, whether across town or on the other side of the world, and to the status of our planet's health or lack thereof. That access presents us, doesn't it, with an obvious challenge to seek and to pay attention to the truth. And as theologian Gustavo Gutierrez suggests, to move our centers of gravity outside of ourselves, to join the dance of all creation with its richness and diversity, helping to see more clearly how our lives, our personal choices, our public policies, and our culture impact people everywhere, negatively or positively. And that refers directly, in my mind, to the beauty of the lives of women, particularly in religious congregations, whose lives are given to a dance with life, that where your center of gravity is outside of yourself. It's in your community, it's in your neighborhood, it's in your country, it's with suffering people. That's what we all need to learn how to do. But some of you have heard me say before that I do believe humanity is on the threshold of a new way of being, a new paradigm, a new logic for life, and that embracing nonviolence will help us move in that direction. For decades, many of us have been working for social justice, for peace, for human rights, and for a sustainable relationship with the earth, our common home. And actually, we have seen real positive change. Last night, I had a wonderful conversation with 5 young people from Clinton. It was their conversation, and I did a lot of listening and learning. But one of the places where we agreed was that there actually have been many positive changes over the last couple of decades in the way we function as a society. For example, we're much more aware now that racism is systemic in our society, and not only individual prejudice. We're learning what that means. It's not easy, but we're learning what that means, and we're beginning to understand that it requires a different kind of response than a personal response. That's part of it, but it's not enough. We know that the proliferation of plastics, for example, is not the unmitigated good that it was thought to be a century ago. When I was a child, nobody ever talked about we really should not be using single-use plastics, because where they go. But fascinating. That's a step forward. We have begun to really experience the beauty of diversity as well as its challenge. And we know that when we find ourselves more and more often in communities that speak many languages or more than one language, and we have to figure out how to communicate with each other. We in Assisi community where I live, for the last year, we've had the gift of a young Venezuelan family of migrants living with us. And the children, of course, learned English in about 10 minutes. They, have it down now. They're totally fluent. But the mom and dad are struggling. And most of the people in our community do not speak Spanish. So everybody has become very adept with, a phone translator and figuring out how to do that. In many ways, that's challenging. It's not easy to do that. But it's also such a gift to be interacting with this beautiful family that, it's not always easy, but it is total gift. We know that every person should be treated with dignity, and every person should have a place at our societal table. We know that if we look carefully through the chaos that I'm certainly feeling, and I suspect you are as well, and the often fear-based backlash that we encounter in our society now, we can see real progress toward the good. Teilhard de Chardin believed that humankind would eventually turn toward a single force that unites without destroying, the force of love as understood in the gospel. Czech philosopher Thomas Halleck believes that that decisive moment is happening right now. Interesting, challenging. Deep transformation is hard for all of us. It rattles the ground that we thought we were standing on, especially if we have to rearrange our fundamental worldview and step into the unknown. If we have to have a conversation with someone we know we disagree with, but we commit ourselves to trying to listen for the common ground. We commit ourselves to trying to understand where we might agree. All over the world, people are working for that transformation. Take a few minutes each week, if you have a few minutes, to read nonviolence news. It's just nonviolencenews.org, easy to find. In just the last week, the editor, Rivera's son, has told stories about nonviolent struggles for a better world this is just in this week, Ecuador, South Korea, Sudan, Australia, India, Mexico, Kazakhstan, Hungary, Kenya, England, and the United States. Just that fact alone is such a source of hope. These stories don't get told. They don't get very often on the front page of the major newspapers, but they are important stories, even if they involve 10 people or 20 people. Some of the actions that she described have been for earth justice, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, and peace in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and in Sudan. The activities were all different because they were all in different contexts. So whoever was there planning an action did it according to their norms, to their culture. Many were very creative. Some were very large, huge. Some were very small, just a few people. Some were successful, and some were not. Most were part of a long-term effort for social transformation. I think it's important for us to look for those stories and tell them to each other. Franciscan Sister Ilia Delio talks about the new person emerging in evolution who is called into a new type of consciousness where things are first seen together and then as distinct within that togetherness. It pushes back on our sort of proclivity for rugged individualism, I think. We first see our communities together, and then we recognize the gifts of each unique person within the community. She believes that we are being rewired for belonging to the cosmic whole. We are more and more aware that we're one Earth community and are beginning to see that, according to Ilia, that systems in nature do not work on principles of competition and struggle, but on cooperation and sympathy. Really interesting. In other words, we humans really are opening our eyes, literally. We're beginning to shift from dominating and extracting to reciprocity, living with, and respecting. But that shift is hard, both personally and culturally, and it's still pretty unseen because we see a lot of extracting and manipulating and overpowering. Again, Michael Nagler talks about the new story that is replacing the old story about scarcity, competition, and violence. He insists that violence is not in the nature of humans. You often will hear people say, well, violence is just a part of who we are. He disagrees. He believes that love, faith, trust, and a desire for community, peace, and well-being are essential to our identity. Violence, he says, is a tendency that pulls us back away from the recognition of unity. Nonviolence pulls us forward toward that recognition. The discovery of our capacity for nonviolence, connected as it is with higher consciousness or love, is key to this development. Nonviolence is not only at home in the new story, it is the new story, he says. It's a really interesting sort of package to think about. Who are we fundamentally as humans? Do we actually instinctively come into conflict with each other? There are always conflicts, but where do we find common ground? I agree with Michael Nagler. I believe that we do yearn for peace, for well-being, for community, for all of the sort of basic needs that once met actually provide us with security. It's a different kind of security, but I think he really has an important point. This new nonviolent paradigm toward which we are moving is also based on a very different idea of our place as humans in the spectacular cosmic reality that we are just now beginning to see, thanks to the Hubble and the Webb telescopes and to other amazing scientific discoveries. I don't know about you, but I cannot look at the photographs from the Webb telescope without just having it take my breath away. Did you see the other day there was one of two, I forget how they described it, it was like two solar systems hugging each other. It was just spectacular. At Dulles Airport in Washington, when you get off the metro and walk to the terminal, all along the walkway are pictures from the Hubble and Webb telescopes, and I thought, what a great thing to have people look at when they have a few minutes to kind of absorb beauty and something spectacular. Cosmic consciousness really is beginning to affect who we are, how we live, everything we do. The ground has shifted. The context for every dimension of life is different. And I think that takes some stretching to really understand what that means. That's the backdrop as we learn to embrace nonviolence. A new way of thinking that maybe could guide the world, including in times of extreme crisis like we are in right now, toward peace rooted in justice rather than toward justified war, toward respect and inclusion rather than exploitation, toward reciprocity and solidarity. As Ruth read Nonviolence from our little book, we repeat often, nonviolence is a spirituality, it's a way of life, it's a global ethic, and a proven, effective, diverse array of tools for transforming conflict, for preventing and interrupting violence, for building a more just world and a sustainable future. It helped me a lot when I began to understand nonviolence as broad and deep, not only no to violence, but yes to a whole new way of being. Nonviolence is also not magic, as you know well. It is not always, or not yet, up to the monumental task of stopping a brutal military onslaught and other really egregious expressions of violence. At the same time, nonviolence is woefully underfunded, especially in comparison to the world's investment, especially ours, in weapons, in military training, and in other preparations for war. Yet, I do see a shift to nonviolence happening everywhere. I know, and I'll bet you do too, thousands of people, whole communities around the world who are giving their lives to making this new story real. I see it in the brilliant work to root out systemic racism, to end the death penalty and mass incarceration, to redress centuries of oppression against indigenous communities, to break habits of exploitation that are destroying the earth, to learn and promote restorative justice practices, to welcome migrants and refugees, to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And I use that little list of what I see because when I began to write that paragraph, and I've used it many times, I was looking at my own children and my grandchildren and what they're doing with their lives. And that list of change that I believe is on the horizon was a list coming from them and their activities, from their friends, from my grandchildren now. It's phenomenal, and they are not alone. But why is this hopeful shift to nonviolence happening now? First, I believe that we humans are just really tired of violence. One glance around the world, including at our own cultural and political battlefield, makes it clearer and clearer that we really need a dramatic course correction. I find everybody gets that, says, oh yeah, you need to, but how do we do it? Secondly, nonviolence is at the heart of the gospel in the Sermon on the Mount, as Ruth read earlier, and is deeply embedded in the beliefs and the practices of many other faith traditions and cultures. And that common ground that we have with many other traditions, faith traditions, and cultural practices is phenomenal. Third, nonviolence works. We know that, and we're also realizing the importance of increased investment in research and training to strengthen our capacity to apply effective nonviolent approaches even in extremely dangerous circumstances. I think you all know of the work of Maria Stephan and Eric Chenoweth, who wrote the book in 2011, Why Civil Resistance Works. They were the first to do empirical research on the use of nonviolence to make major change in a society, to throw out a dictator or stop an invasion or whatever. And they showed that nonviolence was twice as effective, much more effective than violence. They've continued their research, and many other researchers are also engaged in examining what works when. How do we learn to use nonviolent strategies more effectively? How do we strengthen our capacity to respond so the next time there's an invasion of a country that was unexpected, the world will be better able to respond without violence? We know that nonviolence works. Not every time, not all the time, but we can do a lot better. And fourth, everything is connected, as Pope Francis so often says. Security and dignity will be realized for everyone or for no one. And I think we know that. We talk about security, we talk about national security, but the reality is it's all or none. And I think we can only do that by nonviolence. In order to move in that new nonviolent direction, however, we have to believe that it is actually possible, that we actually can move to a new paradigm of nonviolence. The world is awash in multiple expressions of violence, but nonviolence offers us a powerful way to respond. It opens the space for creative, life-giving alternatives, trains us for active love, and for healing rather than for fear and killing, and we believe is a sign of God's nonviolent love. Yes, I think we have to believe that a shift to nonviolence is possible. And then we have to work at becoming nonviolent ourselves. At least I know I do, which will require training and discipline, planning and spiritual practice, personal and communal preparation. It's not just in the airwaves that make it possible to kind of absorb how do you do nonviolence. It takes training and practice. And those of you who are teachers at any level or have an influence in an educational system, include training in nonviolent skills as part of the educational program. I'm increasingly convinced that we can help make a difference in our communities, literally right here in the United States and in our world, by making sure that our schools and universities, our parishes and libraries and community centers offer trainings and workshops in specific nonviolent skills or practices, including, for example, nonviolent communication. How do we talk to each other? Nonviolent self-defense. What do I do if I'm threatened? Active bystander intervention and de-escalation. What do I do if I'm in a crowd and it begins to tense up and move toward violence? How can I learn how to de-escalate? Restorative justice, online nonviolence, trauma awareness and healing, nonviolent civilian-based defense, unarmed civilian protection. I'm part of a wonderful proposal to send a very large, very well-prepared team of about 100 unarmed civilian protectors to Gaza and the West Bank as soon as there's a ceasefire. It's a big project. People will go for a year, but there are about 60 organizations in the world that do send unarmed accompaniers into zones of war and conflict, and who have been trained to de-escalate the tension. And we think it's possible to do that in Israel and Palestine. We'll see what happens. But as you know well, the challenge and the opportunity is much deeper and wider than a list of trainings and courses. In his new book on the Synoptic Gospels, The Gospel of Peace, John Deere affirms much of what I just said when he says nonviolence is much more than a tactic or a strategy. It is a way of life that is based on the oneness of creation, the unity of life itself. And in a recent interview with John Deere, James Lawson, the great visionary of the civil rights movement who died just a few weeks ago, said, "Nonviolence is that quality that comes out of all the great world religions. The notion that the creative force of the universe is love, that God is love, and that love is all-encompassing." This fall, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative will be in Rome for more than a month to deliver in many ways as we can our message to participants in the Catholic Church's Synod Assembly and as well as to the official Catholic Church. Our message is simple. Nonviolence is at the heart of the gospel. It is what Jesus taught and how Jesus lived. Nonviolence is effective. And the Church, with its tremendous capacity for training, formation, and education, has a unique opportunity to counter the global crisis of violence by recommitting to the centrality of gospel nonviolence. The Clinton Franciscan community especially will be with us every step of the way while we're in Rome. Please pray that that simple message that we are trying